To sum everything up quick and easy, he preached more than he slept. And J.C. Ryle summed up Whitfield's life like this. The facts of Whitfield's history are almost entirely of one complexion. One year was just like another. An attempt to follow would be going repeatedly over and over the same ground. From 1739 to the year of his death, which was 1770, a period of 31 years, his life was one of uniform employment. He was eminently a man of one thing, and always about his master's business. From Sunday mornings to Saturday nights, from the 1st of January to the end of December, except when sick, he was almost always preaching Christ and going about the world entreating men to repent, come to Christ, and be saved. He was a born dramatist. He outacted the actors of his day. He believed that what he was proclaiming, which was the truth, needed to be taught more and should be taught with power and persuasion, much more than the actors of that day. His enthusiasm sold this gospel. He was accused many times of selling his gospel, but he was not ashamed to use his talents to light the fire of the gospel throughout London and America. I'd like to show you a clip really quick of a modern-day dramatist who's reading Mark 10:52, which is a gospel that Whitfield preached from in one of his 18,000 sermons.
Then they came to Jericho, and as Jesus and his disciples, along with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, that is, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me!" Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me!" Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus. "Your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight, and he followed Jesus along the road.
That gives us a glimpse, a small glimpse, in what it would be like to hear George Whitfield preach as a dramatist. He was born in 1714 at the Bell Inn in Gloucester, which was a busy dining room and tavern, the finest hostelry in all of England, or at least in that part of England. George was the youngest of 7. His parents, Thomas and Elizabeth, were very wealthy and influential in their parish. When George was 2, his father passed away, and his mother took over the family business. His mother remained a widow for 8 years and then remarried a man named Capel Longden. George said that the marriage proved to be what the world would call an unhappy match as for temporals. Unfortunately, the family business suffered, and at the age of 15, George dropped out of his private school so he could assist them in the inn. He did this for about a year and a half. The inn exposed young Whitfield to the full cast of life's characters: merchants, actors, gamblers, prostitutes, drunks, pickpockets, politicians, and clergymen. And he learned how to win the favor of people different from himself. And in this diverse audience, Whitfield began to cultivate this art of conversation and storytelling. In 1732, he entered Oxford University. He was 18. He began to think more seriously about his future. And with encouragement from his principal and mother, Whitfield sought out entrance to Pembroke College at Oxford as a servitor. He would be a scholarship student who made his way by serving as a house servant to wealthier students. For example, he would empty their slop buckets. He was at the bottom of the social ladder as a result of this at Oxford, and the wealthier students never socialized with the servitors. And even though his personality made his life better than most, he was still isolated and lonely. The following year, George was invited to breakfast by Charles Wesley to meet with a group called the Oxford Methodists. Mockingly, the group was called the Holy Club, and it was here where George began to find himself a group that he could fit in. Amongst these young Methodists, the Holy Club existed to seek a more experiential and morally meaningful faith. They would read Puritan classics and discuss and pray. And George would eventually become the leader of this group in 1735 when Charles and John left for America. I want to talk about the new birth. This is really the theme that kind of came in and woke him up. He was saved at the age of 20, and this lasted throughout most of his preaching, this new birth, and it really was a part of his theme. And so in the year 1733, he borrowed a book from the Wesleys. It was called The Life of God and the Soul of Man by Henry Scougal. And it was this book that helped him understand the need for a new birth. And from the journals we can read, at his first reading it, I wondered what the author meant by saying that some falsely placed religion in going to church, doing hurt to no one and being constant in the duties of the closet, and now and then reaching out their hands and giving alms to the poor and to their neighbors. Alas, though if this be not true religion, what is? An inward change of heart was needed. This is what Scougal called the union of the soul with God, and Christ formed within us. Whitfield writes, "A ray of divine light was instantaneously darted upon my soul, and from that moment did I know that I must be a new creature." One of the passages that kept working on Whitfield was John 3:6-8. The flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. You should not be surprised at my saying, you must be born again. The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Striving for assurance of his salvation, he continued to fast and ask the Lord for forgiveness over and over. His struggles can remind us of the asceticism of Martin Luther. His fasting had made him very ill, and his physician laid him on bed rest for weeks. In the bed, as he continued to list his sin and ask the Lord for forgiveness day after day, but he obtained no life of God within his soul. It was here, knowing of his sin and his inability to save himself, that God put the assurance he was seeking in his soul. Whitfield was 20 years old when this conversion took place, and he testified concerning this. God was pleased to remove the heavy load, to enable me to lay hold of his dear Son by a living faith, and by giving me the spirit of adoption to seal me even to the day of everlasting redemption. Oh, with what joy, joy unspeakable, even joy that was full of and big with glory, was my soul filled when the weight of sin fell off. An abiding sense of the love of God broke in upon my disconsolate soul. Surely it was a day to be had in everlasting remembrance. My joys were like a springtide and overflowed the banks. Armed with this new faith, he began studying on his knees every day using his Bible, his Greek Testament, and a copy of Matthew Henry's commentary, which he had received on loan. He studied continually and grew in the grace and knowledge of our Lord. People began to tell him he should go into the ministry. Even though he had admired preachers ever since he was a child, he now knew the levels of responsibility as a believer he would have if he pursued the ministry. Whitfield said, "Lord, I cannot go. I shall be puffed up with pride and fall into the snare of the devil." He prayed that God would make it clear, and Whitfield continued to come under conviction that he was being called into the ministry. He was ready to yield all and submit to this holy labor. In Gloucester, Bishop Benson had recognized his zeal and was ready to ordain him, even though he was only 21 years old. Whitfield had been teaching small groups and delivering the gospel to everyone he encountered, but no formal preaching from the pulpit. In Gloucester, he had his first opportunity to preach, and this is where he realized that he was gifted to preach. In London, and having been ordained to preach, he now could go into the churches and preach. His first church was St. Mary de Crypt, and he wrote a letter to a friend to describe the experience. Last Sunday, I preached my first sermon in the church of St. Mary de Crypt. That's where I was baptized. Curiosity drew a large congregation. The sight at first a little awed me, but I was comforted with a heartfelt sense of the divine presence, and soon found unspeakable advantage of having been accustomed to speaking when I was a boy at school, exhorting and teaching prisoners when I was at the university. By these means, I was kept from being daunted over too much, as I perceived the fire kindled, till at last, though so young and amidst a crowd of those I had known even since I was an infant, I trust I was enabled to speak with some degree of gospel authority. A few mocked, but most for the present seemed struck and heard. I have since heard that a complaint had been made to the bishop that drove 15 mad the first sermon. The worthy prelate wished the madness might not be forgotten before the next Sunday. A friend of his asked him to minister at the chapel of the Tower of London. Having never been to London, this was intimidating, but he accepted the invitation. And it went well, and they asked him to stay for 2 months. During this time, he spoke about this new birth. And after this, he returned to Oxford. And there he decided to become, that was there where he decided to become a missionary to Georgia in the States. Upon reading letters from New World sent by John Wesley, asking for help because Charles, his brother, was tiring. And he was coming back to England. His plan was to wait and depart with Oglethorpe, the founder of Georgia. Having decided to become this missionary, he headed to Bristol to bid farewell. And after preaching in Bristol, the crowds demanded that he preach again. And they stayed to hear him preach another night. And the crowds at the church didn't have room to hold him. They had to turn people away. His preaching became so popular that it was said that in the heat of all of those in attendance would create a steam that would drip from the pillars like drops of rain. He returned to London to depart for Savannah with Oglethorpe, but realized it wasn't time. So then he began to preach again in London. He was now preaching 9 times a week. His preaching was reaching even the most noble, and for months his popularity grew. It had run very high. In a short time, he could no longer walk on foot. He had to get into a carriage just to avoid, as he says, the hosannas of the multitude, because they grew quite extravagant with their applauses. And he says that if it hadn't been for my compassionate high priest, the popularity would have destroyed me. I used to plead with him to take me by the hand and lead me unhurt into this fiery furnace. He heard my request and helped me to see the vanity of all the commendations but his own alone. Finally, he decided he can wait on Oglethorpe any longer, and so he scheduled to depart for Savannah. On December 30th, 1737, George boarded a boat named the Whitaker to head to America. God give me, he prayed, a deep humility, well-guided zeal, and a burning love, and a single eye, and that men or devils do their worst. He would be a chaplain for the boat. On the boat, there was the crew, 20 or so women and children, and around 100 soldiers. The boat was headed for Savannah, Georgia, and the soldiers that were on there would help Georgia defend itself from Spanish Florida. On the first morning of the cruise, he announced his intention to know nothing among them save Jesus Christ and him crucified. This brought ridicule from the crew. So he took his time, and he began by just reading prayers on the deck. He knew preaching would not be welcome. He started a catechism class, and as the attendance grew, he included prayers in the morning and a short sermon. The captain suggested one day that they create makeshift pews and have a service. Soon thereafter, the other 2 ships they were traveling with joined them, and he preached to all 3. On the 17th of May, 1738, they arrived in Savannah. Whitfield was no longer with the large crowds. This entire population of Savannah was less than 1,000. Even still, in less than 1 month, they didn't have a place large enough to worship. And leaving behind, even though in the midst of the preaching, we need to remember that he was a Methodist, and they would view their deeds over their creeds, as they would say. So Whitfield was constantly looking for opportunities to do good. And it was there in Savannah when the soldiers would go to war and they brought their families and their children, they would pass away. He started seeing a need for orphans. And this began to be a pursuit of his to open an orphanage in Savannah, Georgia, which is the first charity in America, and it's still there to this day. If you haven't been there, you should take a look at it. He returned to London now because he wanted to raise money for this cause. Okay, let's see where we are. I've got 5 minutes. I better kick it up a notch. When he returned, he had been corresponding with a Welshman. His name was Howell Harris. He had encouraged him to preach outside the church altogether because the churches no longer had room to hold him. His popularity had grown so much. So he decided to go to Bristol, and there was a community of coal miners there in Kingwood. He went door to door asking them to come here and preach. And the first time there were 200 listeners. About it, he said, "Blessed be to God, I have broken the ice. I believe I was never more acceptable to my master than when I was standing to teach those hearers in the open fields. Some may censure me, but if it thus please men, I should not be the servant of Christ." The following Wednesday he returned, and this time the crowd had 2,000 listeners. Friday he returned and had 4,000 listeners. On Sunday, after preaching in Bristol, he returned to Kingswood to teach around 4 p.m. and was greeted by 10,000 hearers, 200 to 10,000. He was holding around 30 meetings a week in and around Bristol, and he knew he needed to help, so he asked John Wesley to come. Wesley was reluctant. He gave in finally, and he said, Brother Whitfield expounded on Sunday to 6,000 or 7,000 at Bowling Green, at noon to the same amount, and at 5 to what appeared to be 30,000 men from the Mount on Rose Green. Wesley didn't see this outdoor preaching as proper, however. Fortunately, George tricked him by inviting him to listen to preach again, and when he arrived, George thrust him into his place. This began the style of preaching for John Wesley that would mark the rest of his life. And Wesley took over for him in Bristol as Whitfield left for London. In London, his first Sunday, he preached in a park called the Moorfields. Word had gotten out, and it was such a large crowd, he was going to have to preach actually from scaffolding that had been used for hangings. In this place, it was full of poor people, and Whitfield was known to say, he said, there was no man here who cared for their souls. There were no less than 30,000 people gathered that evening to hear him. And every morning and every evening following, he returned to Kensington, and even on Sunday, he would go to Moorfields. These crowds at times exceeded 50,000. And he used these gatherings to preach the gospel and collect funds for the orphanage in Savannah. He was overwhelmed with invitations to preach, but he needed to go back to America in 2 weeks. He had already booked his trip. The fact is, this pace should have worn him down, but it seemed to exhilarate him. Can you imagine the level of voice it would take to project and be heard by these people? I have a microphone in this tiny little room. However, he made several reports of feeling increased joy and strength as a result of preaching. When we came home, he said, God was pleased to pour into my soul a great spirit of supplication, a sense of free, distinguishing mercy, so filled with love, humility, joy, and holy confusion, that I could at last only pour out my heart before him in awful silence. Oh, the happiness of communion with God. And some have doubted these numbers, and there are many sources to back it up and throughout his journal. And also, Benjamin Franklin, who was a good friend of him, when he was in the States, measured a distance that he could hear his voice and computed that he could easily be heard by more than 30,000 if you gave each person about 2 feet. Whitfield and Wesley did have an ongoing quarrel. Wesley was an Arminian. Whitfield was a Calvinist. However, Whitfield used the term doctrines of grace. That's what he preferred. Much of influence came from Matthew Henry, and he is said to have never read anything written by Calvin. Here's a quote from Whitfield on election. For my own part, I cannot see how true humbleness of mind can be attained without a knowledge of election. And though I will not say that everyone who denies election is a bad man, yet I will say, with that sweet singer Mr. Trail, it is a very bad sign. Such a one, whoever he be, I think cannot truly know himself. For if we deny election, we must partly at least glory in ourselves. But our redemption is so ordered that no flesh should glory in the divine present. And hence it is, the pride of man opposes this doctrine, because, according to this doctrine, no other, that he that glories must glory only in the Lord. But what shall I say? Election is a mystery that shines with such resplendent brightness that, to make use of the words of one who is drunk deeply of electing love, it dazzles the weak eyes even of some of God's dear children. However, though they know it not, all the blessings they receive, all the privileges they do enjoy, all through Jesus Christ flow from the everlasting love of God the Father. What Whitfield saw, which was real in his new eyes, was the link between election and perseverance. God had chosen him unconditionally, and God would therefore keep him invincibly. This was his rock-solid confidence and a fire in his bones in the power of obedience. In 1739, he wrote from Philadelphia, "Oh, the excellencies of the doctrine of election, and of the saints of the final perseverance, who are truly sealed by the Spirit of promise." And a year later, he wrote to John Wesley, "The doctrine of election and the final perseverance of those that are truly in Christ, I am 10,000 times more convinced of when I saw you last." George Whitfield, not John Wesley. It's easy to get them confused because they're all over the place. George Whitfield was America's first celebrity. When he returned then to America, he would call that his vacation across the pond. He took 13 trips. It's an odd number because he died in America. So each time he would get on the boat and go, it was about a 4-month journey, and that was his vacation. So that's the only time he really took a break, when he was on a boat, fighting off death and getting sick and preaching the entire time. So he would go back to London to raise money and to see his wife, which I'll talk about later. Which I'm running out of time, so let's... Well, tensions began to grow between America and England, and Whitfield saw he'd have to make a decision. Wesley would remain loyal to England, and Whitfield could not. His institutional attachments and personal identification with the colonies were stronger now than his loyalty to the crown. Estimates are that 80% of the entire population of the American colonies heard Whitfield at least one time. Stout, an author and historian, shows that Whitfield's impact on America was such that he can justly be styled America's first cultural hero. Before Whitfield, there was no unifying intercolonial person or event. Indeed, before him, is doubtful that any name other than royalty was known equally from Boston to Charleston. But by 1750, virtually every American loved and admired Whitfield and saw him as their champion. I want to read you a story about an event describing one of these events when he came and preached. And this is a man named Nathan Cole. I don't know the story of who he was. This is kind of like a like on Facebook, right? But this is how it was in those days. This is what you would have heard. This letter. And this is a long one, so hang in there. Now it pleased God to send Mr. Whitfield into this land, and of my hearing of his preaching at Philadelphia, like one of the old apostles, and many thousands flocking to hear him preach the gospel, and great numbers were then converted to Christ, I felt the Spirit of God drawing me by conviction, and I longed to see and hear him, and I wished he would come this way. And as soon as I heard he had come to New York and to the Jerseys, and the great multitudes flocking after him, and the great concern for their souls, and many converted, this brought my concern on more and more. And I hoped to see him next when he was in Long Island. And one morning, all of a sudden, at 8 or 9 o'clock, there came a messenger that said, Mr. Whitfield has preached at Hartford and Westerfield yesterday, and he's to preach at Middleton at 10 o'clock tomorrow. I was in my field at work. At 10 o'clock this morning, I was in my field at work. I dropped my tool, and I grabbed my wife. I grabbed the horse. I brought my horse home and soon mounted my wife onto the horse and went forward as fast as I thought the horse could bear. And then when the horse began to be out of breath, I would get down and put my wife up on the saddle and bid her ride as fast as she could and not stop or slack for me except I bade her. And so I would run until I was much out of breath and then get on the horse again. And so I did this several times to favor the horse. We improved moments as we were trying to get along as if we were fleeing for our lives, all the while fearing we should be too late to hear the sermon. We had 12 miles to ride, double in little more than an hour, and we went around the Upper House Parish. And when we came about a half a mile of the road that comes from Hartford, Wethersford, and Stripney to Middletown, on high land I saw before me a cloud of fog rising. I first thought it came from the great Connecticut River, but as I came nearer to the road, I heard a loud noise, something like a low rumbling thunder, and presently found it was the noise of horses' feet coming down on the road. And this cloud was a cloud of dust made by the horses' feet. It arose some rods into the air over the tops of the hills and the trees, and it came when I came within 20 rods of the road, I could see the men and the horses slipping along in the cloud like shadows. And as I drew near, it seemed like a steady stream of horses and their riders, scarcely a horse, more than its length behind another, all of a lather with foam and sweat, their breath rolling out of their nostrils in the cloud of dust. Every jump, every horse seemed to be going with all of his might to carry his rider to hear the good news of heaven and for the saving of souls. It made me tremble to see the sight and how this world was in such a struggle. I found a vacance between two horses, slipped in with my horse, and my wife said, "Oh, our clothes are going to be spoiled, for all that were covered with dust." And everyone was covered in dust, even the horses. We went down through the stream of horses, and no man spoke a word all the way 3 miles as we pressed forward in great haste. And when we got to the old meeting house, there was a great multitude. There were 3,000 to 4,000 people there assembled together. We got off from our horses, shook off the dust, and at this time the ministers were coming into the meeting house. We looked towards the great river and saw the ferry boats running swiftly forward and bringing over loads of people, and the oars rowing nimble and quick, and everything, and every man and every horse seemed to be struggling for their lives. The land of the banks overflowed with people up and down, and I saw no one working in the field. Everyone had seemed to disappear. Then I saw Mr. Whitfield come up on the scaffolding. He looked like an angel, a young, slim, slender youth before some thousands of people with a bold, undaunted countenance. And my hearing of how God was with him everywhere he came along, it solemnized my mind, and it put into me a trembling of fear before he began to preach. It looked as if he was clothed with authority from the great God, and a sweet solemnity sat upon his brow. And my hearing him preach gave my heart a wound. By God's blessing, my old foundation was broken up, and I saw that my righteousness would not save me. Then I was convinced of the doctrine of election and went right to quarreling with God about it, because all that I could do would not save me. And he had decreed from eternity who would be saved and who would not be saved. So there's a like on Facebook in Whitfield's day, not just a button. little impressive. I'll speak really shortly about his marriage. To make short of marriage, marriage is an important thing, but for George Whitfield, it was a necessity. He said, I believe it's God's will that I should marry. So he wrote to a friend in 1740. He says, I pray that I will have a wife, but not until I can live as though I had none. His friend Howell Harris, we spoke about earlier, who had introduced him to outdoor preaching, was fond of a Welsh widow named Elizabeth James. And Welsh Howell Harris, having not committed to having a wife and having nothing between him and God, decided, well, she's interested in me, maybe she'll be interested in Whitfield. So he wrote to Whitfield, and Whitfield said, okay, I'm interested. So he shows up, proposes to marry her. There was some deliberation, but she said yes. And so on November 14th, 1741, they were married. He stayed with her for a week. He preached the entire week. And then he began a tour of preaching in Bristol, Gloucester, and in London. She did bear a son after 3 years. They were traveling through Gloucester, and they stayed at the Bell Inn, which is where he was actually born. His brother was running it by now, and they wanted to visit. Unfortunately, while they were there, the baby became ill, and despite the best efforts of their physician, the baby died. Newborn baby. His wife would accompany him on his next trip to America, but they went to Scotland first. Real quick, I'll just say she didn't go back to America. She stayed in London, and when he kept going back to America, she stayed in London. So she stayed there. They were separated most of their life. I'll say finally, in closing, I'll talk about his last sermon. And I joked earlier, because I've been coughing for so long, I thought about just reading his last sermon today, and then, because it's appropriate. But Whitfield, this is a testimony to his preaching. Most of his career was burgeoning in his early 20s. So here, this is a description of what happened on that day. Mr. Clarkson said, "Sir, you are more fit to go to bed than you are to preach." Very sick. It's very visibly sick. This was on Saturday, September the 29th. He was worn out from all these tours, and he was suffering from asthma, and he was heading for Newburyport, Massachusetts, where he was scheduled to preach. "True, sir," Whitfield says, and turned his eyes upward in prayer. "Lord Jesus, I am weary in thy work, but not of thy work. If I have not yet finished my course, let me go and speak for 3 once more in the fields, seal the truth, and let me come home and die." Just a week earlier, he had written to a friend in London and said that he knew that the day of release would shortly come. In that same letter, he aspired to give even greater dedication. "Oh, for a warm heart. Oh, to stand fast in the faith, to acquit ourselves like men and be strong." Now, he showed us what it's like to live by that prayer, indicating that he would speak. He was helped up onto a large barrel, and there he stood, shaky and weak. "I will wait for the gracious assistance of God." And he waited. And he knew that God will. And he said, "I am certain. Assist me once more to speak in his name." And miraculously, he did get the strength. Witnesses said they seemed to see the Holy Spirit descend upon him and grow strong enough to preach 2 hours on this one text. "Test yourselves to see if you are in the faith." He spoke also of going to Christ, and afterward he continued on to Newburyport. Following dinner, he was actually much stronger. And on his way to bed, he acknowledged the request of a small gathering people in the stairway there and sat with them and gave some words of exhortation by candlelight. In his bedroom, he read, prayed, and laid down for the night, propped up on pillows to ease his breathing. About 2 in the morning he woke, having trouble catching his breath. My asthma's coming on again, he told Smith, who was his assistant. And he said, Whitfield, I wish you wouldn't preach so often. And he said, a quote you may have heard, I would rather wear out than rust out. And the evangelist then prayed that the Lord would bless the preaching he had already done and what he was about to do. And he asked God's guidance for where he should spend the winter. And then he fell asleep about 3. An hour later, he woke again, saying he was suffocating. And by 6, he was dead. Hundreds of thousands in America and Britain, both pastors and lay people, owed their spiritual awakening to him. And America owns its spiritual awakening to him as well. That's it. That's George Whitfield. That's about 1/10 of the material out there.
Couple quick questions
Go right ahead.
before you complete. In your research, did you come to an opinion as to what drove him to make the trek to America? His motivations?
I believe it was the popularity in London that drove him, because he was getting so popular, and he was a very humble man. I mean, it was in his nature as a kid to get up and talk at school and be a dramatist, and he was that naturally. And I believe, just after what I've read, he did that because he was trying to get away from the popularity in London. But then when he got to America and saw they needed to raise funds for Bethesda, he went back and took advantage of that popularity and passed the plate around and kept raising money. And I didn't talk about some of the bad things with Whitfield, but history's full of controversy. So
You mentioned humility, and as a follow-up, from your understanding, what do you think were some of the motivations for that? Humility.
His childhood. I mean, his parents were rich. He had a lot, but they lost a lot. So he had seen that even before he was a believer. So that was in him. That was part of his programming. I think that drove him. And then once he was saved, after all of his desire to be saved, I think he was lit, and he wouldn't shut up. He never shut up. He just gave the gospel, 18,000 sermons. So I think his drive was from God. I mean, it's very apparent. The Holy Spirit was in him.
Anyone else have a quick question?
Who's up next?
It would be fun to hear more about, they use the word, but the controversies between Wesley and Whitfield, because there were so
Yeah.
many, it became
It's
quite intense on Wesley's side.
my conclusion on that is that Wesley's doctrine of free will fit better with the American ideals. It fit better with this idea of pulling on your bootstraps and taking off and doing your own thing. And so Wesley was a better fit, and his popularity grew as a result of that. And Whitfield, over and over and over and over again, pursued Wesley in a humble way to try and correct him. So, I mean, it's on record that he was extremely humble about him, even when he rebuked him. So I think it was in Wesley's nature. He was more of a type A. He was more of a, I'm gonna do this kind of person. And Whitfield might not have been that. He was kind of a dramatist. That's why I showed you the clip. That was really his skill sets. It wasn't organizing and, taking ground. He just went and 30,000 people showed up. So, I mean, Wesley owes that to him. But he says a lot of things wonderful about Wesley, because Wesley handed him the book that introduced him to the faith that he has. The life of God in the soul of man, that book. So, I mean, there's the controversy between the two of them. History has written in favor of Wesley, and I think it's because he earned the favor of some of the counts, the more influential people of the time. So even then, he kind of started the historical ball rolling in his favor. And we know Whitfield's, I would say the biggest controversy was his views on slavery. That's the biggest controversy, because it's hard to reconcile that he's trying to raise more money for his orphanage. And he said, if Georgia would just legalize slavery, I could bring in more money, and with this money, I could build this orphanage bigger. And it's kind of like, well, you're taking parents away from their kids in Africa, you know, to do, it's just mind-blowing that in the time of that culture that they were not sensitive to that. But he's a human being, he's a sinner just like the rest of us, and, you know, that's, you know, something that we can look back on, and he may not have been able to recognize it, but he's preached that he was the chief of sinners over and over and over again, so he truly was humble in that sense. He just didn't see that.
I love, this is a question, but the letter that the guy wrote, the literary term, clothed in authority, I don't remember exactly, of our great God or of God, but clothed in the authority of God. I mean, that was just a beautiful image.
Yeah, I mean, this is nothing. This stuff that's been written. I didn't even touch his sermons. They're, you know, incredible. And I will say, I have a book. I don't have it with me. Dallimore wrote a 2-part biography. It's about this big, but I've got a smaller book that's much better for me. It's shorter. And then also Piper does a biography every year, and he did a biography on Whitfield that was really helpful. And Steve Lawson also has a book on George Whitfield if you're interested in reading about his fervor in his teaching. So
Excellent. Very good job.
that's it.
Jeremy.
I was just curious if you knew of the website you could point us to where sermons might be accessed. If there was anything like
You
that.
can Google search it. They're all out there. It's open, or what is it? It's what do you call it?
Public domain?
Public domain. Yeah. There are also books. There are many books that just contain his sermons. So if you Google that on Amazon, you'll find his sermons. They're all online though, and you also can listen to them on YouTube. You can most of the popular ones. They're all on YouTube. I think it's 18,000 sermons, and there's something like 77 that are recorded,
Okay.
like written, and then most of them have been people, you know, read them on YouTube. So it's there if you want to hear it. It's all there.
Daryl, excellent job. Daryl, would you close us in a word of prayer?
Our Father, may God want us to praise you for this time we have tonight. Thank you especially for this sweet time of prayer.